Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. As always, I am very happy to be with you on another Tuesday, bringing you another author interview. Actually, in this case, an editor interview. I mentioned at the end of the last episode that I'm interviewing an editor. It's an anthology this week, so a little bit different than some of our usual content, but I was very excited to read something a little bit different, talk to somebody a little bit different, and I very much enjoyed this interview. I hope you had a good weekend, and I hope your week is off to a good start. As always, there is somebody incredibly noisy outside my office right now. I don't know what they're doing, but they're making really weird noises. Hopefully you cannot hear them. Anyway, weekend was good. Worked on Saturday, took a break on Sunday, just hung out and had a bit of a mental health day, which is always nice. My sister and nieces went home on Thursday. They left here Thursday. They got home on Friday, and I missed them. It was so fun to have my nieces, especially my sister too, of course. But they're almost 13 and almost 17, the nieces, and they are just hilarious and smart and complicated and all those wonderful things that teenagers are, and I love them and miss them and worry about them and, enjoy them. The whole gamut of emotions, but it was so great to have them here. And the almost 13-year-old is the one that you've met before. She's been on the podcast a couple times. Still loves reading. Actually, so does the 17-year-old, the almost 18-year-old. Get it right, Auntie. They both love reading, and so it was fun to talk to them about books and what they're reading. And the older one is on TikTok, so she was complaining. Not complaining. We were just dissecting book talk the other day and what our feelings are on that particular means of social media. At any rate, did I say I missed them? Yeah, I missed them. But they got home safely, and they all missed their dog, Lola, and the 13-year-old has chickens, and she loves her chickens. She has a million stuffed animals also named Lola, and she was joking that all 6 chickens' names were Lola. She just calls them the Lolas. Not terribly out of the box in terms of naming things, but she makes me laugh. So let's talk about today's book. It is an anthology, a collection of essays. It is called Latinx Poetics, Essays on the Art of Poetry. It is edited by Ruben Quesada, and let me give you the description of that. Ooh, you know what? He pronounces his name. I don't know. I just said Quesada. It might be Quesada. I apologize if I've said that incorrectly. I should have put it more firmly in my brain after he said it. My apologies. At any rate, Latinx Poetics, Essays on the Art of Poetry, collects personal and academic writing from Latino, Latin American, Latinx, and Luso poets about the nature of poetry and its practice. At the heart of this anthology lies the intersection of history, language, and the human experience. This collection explores the ways in which a people's history and language are vital to the development of a poet's imagination, and insists that the meaning and value of poetry are necessary to understand the history and future of a people. The Latinx community is not a monolith, and accordingly the poets assembled here vary in style, language, and nationality. The pieces selected expose the depth of existing verse and scholarship by poets and scholars, including Brenda Cardenas, Daniel Berzutsky, Orlando Menyes, and over a dozen more. The essays not only expand the poetic landscape, but extend Latinx and Latin American linguistic and geographical boundaries. Writers, educators, and students will find awareness, purpose, and inspiration in this one-of-a-kind anthology. So again, that is the description of Latinx Poetics, essays on the art of poetry. I wasn't quite sure what to expect going into this. Poetry is beautiful and complex, and I don't always get it. Sometimes I struggle with poetry, as you know, if you are a longtime listener of the podcast. Short stories and poetry, not my strongest suits, but then this is a collection of essays on poetry. And so I thought, well, okay, I'm not quite sure what to expect, but I was intrigued. And so I said yes to the interview, and I'm so glad I did, because these, there's such a breadth and a depth of essays in this collection. Different authors from different backgrounds who come from different experiences and who bring a different style of writing to this. As Ruben says, there are some that are very, very personal, some essays that are more academic or scholarly. So you have this wide array of interests and viewpoints and expressions, which means that a reader is going to be able to find something within this collection that he or she is going to feel themselves drawn toward because of the nature of how they're written, or the subject matter, or the level of academics that you look for in your essays. So I was very much pleased with the reading experience, and then the interview was great. So let me stop talking about the interview and let you listen to the interview. Again, the book is called Latinx Poetics, Essays on the Art of Poetry. Let's go to that interview. Hi, Ruben. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here.
I'm happy to have you here, and I'm excited to talk to you as an editor rather than the authors that I normally talk to. I think that will be a lot of fun. We're going to talk about a collection of essays called Latinx Poetry. But before we do that, just so my listeners can get to know you a little bit, would you mind sharing a bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am coming to you from Chicago, Illinois. Originally, I'm from Los Angeles, but I found my way here after many years of school, and I've settled here now. And I am a poet. I'm an editor. I'm a community organizer. And most recently, aside from publishing this wonderful anthology, I launched a nonprofit organization called Mercy Street that does online and in-person literary programming. So I'm finding myself getting deeper and deeper entrenched in literary arts and finding ways to make that come alive here in Chicago.
That's wonderful. It sounds like you've got a lot of good things happening in a variety of different directions.
I do. Thank you. Yes, it's very exciting.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, it's a collection of essays it's called Latinx Poetics, Essays on the Art of Poetry. Can you just give an overview of the book?
Sure. So it's an anthology that collects essays written by poets, and all of these poets are connected to Latin America in one way or another. And the essays are about the poet's experience with poetry. So there are a range of essays from very scholarly examinations of poetry to more personal experiences with poetry and how poetry has lived in the life, or how poets have made a life with poetry. And the anthology collects about 24 contributors, and the majority of these essays about poetry were written specifically for this anthology. So it's a collection of different perspectives about how to write poetry, how poetry lives in someone's life, and they're all written by poets from Latin America, or who have a connection to Latin America, including poets who have a connection to the Portuguese language. I thought that was important, given that Latin America is primarily a Spanish-speaking country, but there are also Portuguese speakers in Latin America. And so I thought it would be a great addition to this already diverse anthology.
Yeah, that's great, because you really do think mainly of Spanish when you think of Latinx. So that's a really great addition. How did this collection come about? Obviously, you wanted to just have a diverse range of authors and essays, but what was the impetus that one day you were just sitting around and this idea was born? How did that happen?
Yeah, it's strange the way ideas come to us. And I was a student many years ago, decades ago, and I was introduced to an anthology of essays about poetry called 20th Century American Poetics that was edited by 3 poets, Dana Gioia, David Mason, and Meg Shirky. And this anthology collects essays that were written by poets throughout the 20th century, poets who we've all probably heard of. I'm thinking about Ezra Pound, Robert Frost, Louise Glick. So these essays were poets throughout the 20th century talking about how they saw poetry in their lives. And there was a particular essay by a poet named Julia Alvarez. She's also written other books. She's primarily known for a novel of hers, her first novel, which was called How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents. And she has this essay in this anthology called So Much Depends. And in it, she talks about how she discovered that William Carlos Williams, the poet William Carlos Williams, is of Puerto Rican descent, and how she didn't know that when she first learned or read him. And she realized that she wanted to read more poetry from people who had a similar background as her, who perhaps understood the Spanish language the way she did. And so her essay is about being embarrassed by her ethnicity and how she felt like she was performing her culture, and something changed inside her, and she felt that she had an obligation or a responsibility to be that voice that she herself needed. And so she writes this essay about the value of being proud of your heritage and sharing about your heritage with the world. And it made me think, I haven't read very many essays by poets about poetry that are like me, who have a connection to Latin America. My family's from Costa Rica, and I even today, I only know maybe 3 or 4 Costa Rican writers in the United States. And so I thought, wouldn't it be great to have an anthology by people who have a connection to Latin America writing about poetry, and only those people, because a book like that just doesn't exist. And over the next decade or so, I gathered interest from different people and put a proposal together, and finally made it happen. So it all came about from just the need. I wanted something like this, and I didn't know any other way to find it except to make it happen.
Well, isn't the quote something like, if the book that you want to read doesn't exist in the world, then you need to write it?
That's right. That's right. I think about that all the time.
It is time for our first break of this episode. When we come back, we'll talk about the inspiration behind this collection of essays. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast, dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with editor Ruben Quesada about the anthology Latinx Poetics. Before the break, he was talking about an anthology that he had read as a student that had gotten him to thinking about essays and essays being written by people that reflect his experience, his language, his culture, etc., and how that inspired him to find poets who were willing to write essays on what it means to be a Latin American, a Latino, a Latinx poet, and why they write poetry, etc. That's what inspired this collection. So let's go ahead and return now to that interview. I love the impetus behind collecting these essays, but when I think about the world of Latin America, the people of Latin America, there's so much diversity. It's just amazing. So how did you go about choosing the essays and the authors and just kind of everything? How'd you go about choosing everything? That's a really vague question.
No, it's a great question. I mean, there's so much to consider. And, one of the toughest things about putting any kind of anthology, any kind of space that gathers different voices, you're always going to leave someone out. Someone's always going to feel excluded. And so I wanted to make sure that I opened up this opportunity to as many people as possible. So for about a year or two, I put a call out to different literary communities that I knew and asked them to share this call to submit essays about poetry for this anthology. And I received a generous amount of submissions, but I also sought out essays from people that I knew. And I ended up receiving many essays from many different perspectives. And I knew that what would help me organize what I wanted to choose would be a broad view of the topic. So I decided to choose essays written by people who had a very personal, intimate view and relationship with poetry, but I also wanted to include perspectives that were much more scholarly and academic. I wanted a mix of both. I wanted something that kind of was across the spectrum of very formal kind of perspectives on poetry to very informal perspectives on poetry. And by opening up the call to submissions, I was able to get a good mix of everything. There are so many anthologies today that collect different perspectives on poetry or collections of poetry by people from Latin America. And often there's a strong attention to language or race. I think that's something that often gets forgotten about Latin America, is that the people of Latin America, as you said, are very diverse through language, regional culture, but also through race. There are, as I've discovered over the years, there are Latin American people who are white, who are Black, who are Asian. It's incredible. It crosses the kind of race lines, and so finding a way to include those perspectives as well was really important to me. And it's not always easy to approach an author, and especially one that I may not know, and figure out, can you tell me what your background is, just to make sure that I'm being inclusive? So that was a little difficult. Sometimes I didn't have access to, an image perhaps of them, or a full background of them. And so that took me some time to really kind of research and try to figure out, how can I be as inclusive as possible in this anthology and ensure that I'm not only providing different perspectives, but I'm also being as inclusive as possible to the diversity of Latin America. So that's one way that I went about choosing my essays. And I think it made it a much fuller collection that way. I'm really happy with it.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, first off, you don't want to make assumptions about people and backgrounds. So I imagine that took a little figuring out as you went along. But one thing I like about the variety of essays is exactly what you said. There are some that are very personal. There are some that are very scholarly. So there's a lot of entry points to this collection. So people can read it from a variety of different viewpoints. If you really like the ones that are more personal, you can kind of gravitate towards those. If you're looking for scholarly, there's that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. One thing that one thing that I love about poetry is that it can introduce me to so many different experiences. But I think what's so valuable about an opportunity like this is that I'm able to introduce people to different perspectives and different experiences with poetry by including a range of essays that can appeal to a general reader, because not everyone's an expert on poetry. And I think that we grow up sometimes thinking that poetry is really difficult, and a lot of people just don't get it. And so I wanted to make sure there were essays in this anthology that people could get, that were just as easy to understand as someone just telling you a story, a friend or a neighbor. And so I wanted that voice. It was really important for me to include that voice in these essays. And so I think this anthology is really appealing to all kinds of people, and of all ages too, and experiences with poetry.
Yes, absolutely. Of course, people who write poetry can also write prose and vice versa. Did you get any kinds of pushback when you said, "Hey, you're a poet, I want you to write an essay"?
That is you must be, you're a mind reader. I mean, that was probably one of the worries that I especially had, because you're right. There aren't a lot of poets who want to spend time thinking about poetry and writing about poetry in prose. I think it's kind of unusual for a poet to spend a lot of time thinking about poetry in this way. I'm not saying that poets don't, but to write about it for publication is an entirely different story. And there were some poets that I did approach, and they just had no interest in doing it. They just it just wasn't something they wanted to think about in that way. Certainly they think about their artwork, and they think about the revision process and how to communicate something in writing. But to write prose about poetry, it takes a whole other form of energy for some poets, and some of them just didn't want to do it.
Which is understandable. That's not your comfort zone. I get that. What do you hope that an average reader might take away from the essays?
People are drawn to this anthology out of curiosity. It's what really drew me to the anthology that inspired me. The anthology that inspired me showed me that poets and writers could think about poetry in a way that extended beyond just the artistic views of poetry. It's something that is alive in someone's life, and that comes to them in many different ways. There's an essay, for instance, in the collection by a poet named Blas Falconer, who is Puerto Rican. And in the essay, he talks about growing up in Puerto Rico and being in the kitchen with his grandmother, and how his grandmother would recite poetry to him while they were baking. And it's that kind of personal history that I think is so valuable to really understand the impact that poetry has in people's lives. And I want people to pick up this anthology because they're curious about not just poetry, but they're curious about the people of Latin America and the way that poetry lives in the lives of people who are neighbors to the South. And I hope people are inspired, maybe even inspired to put their own anthology together. Maybe there's something in my anthology that's missing, and this is an opportunity for someone else to fill that gap. and I hope they do.
Sure. Yeah, I like that. For someone who struggles with poetry, do you hope that this book might inspire them to read poetry specifically, maybe even by a Latinx poet?
I think if someone struggles with poetry, they're going to find something in this book that may appeal to them. I think about there's an essay about by a writer named Stephen Cordova, whose contribution is a series of statements about what it means to be a poet. And I think about the final line or the final sentence in this essay. It says that I sometimes dream a dream of a poem which I can never write. And so, it's this idea that other people's thoughts on poetry might align or challenge our own thoughts about poetry. And my hope is that that helps a reader understand their own views of poetry and the potential that this kind of art form or this kind of expression can have in their lives and they can see it in the lives of others by reading these essays. And maybe that'll give them a moment to reflect on what it is about poetry that they might not understand. And maybe there's an answer in this book. That's what I love about the range of voices in this collection, is that because some of the essays are written so informally, so directly, without all the academic speak, without all the criticism that we might find in a book review, that it'll allow people to understand poems in a different way. I was talking with someone recently about the reviewing process, about literary criticism, and I said, it was really hard for me to wrap my mind around either how to write a book review or how to be critical of a book. And I've learned over time that a book review or book criticism is just an opportunity for someone who is deeply passionate about literature to share with you how they read, to share with you how they go about understanding the material. And so you get this insider view of the way someone thinks and speaks about poetry. And so it gives you tools. It gives you the tools to be able to talk about poetry yourself. The language is so direct, it's so straightforward that it becomes so much more accessible to be able to speak about poetry in a way that I don't think many people have been exposed to. And it's the informal nature of these essays that really create that opportunity. You can see how other people talk about poetry that doesn't necessarily have to be academic talk. And in seeing the way that happens, I think that we can learn how to talk about poetry with people who aren't experts in poetry. I think that's so important, to just be able to be curious about poetry. And even if you're unsure about what poetry means or how to go about understanding a poem, these essays are an attempt to show you how to understand a poem, or an attempt to understand the value of poetry. And it's done in a way that's not meant to gatekeep, that's not meant to confuse anyone. And I really love that. I love these voices. They're just so honest and direct.
We'll be picking this conversation up shortly, but first, our second break of the episode. When we come back, a little bit more about criticism, translation, where those two things intersect, people's experiences of reading things in translation, etc. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with Ruben Quesada, editor of Latinx Poetics. Before the break, he was talking about book criticisms and how they are experienced and how they can influence writing, etc. And we are picking up with that conversation with a follow-up question from me. So just putting that back into your memory banks. Let's get on with the interview. When you were talking about book reviews and literary criticism, I apologize because I can't remember the exact essay that this was in, but it started talking about a criticism, a literary criticism of I think it was a Chilean author, poet, and the one who was criticizing the book said he just didn't have, maybe it lost something in translation because he just didn't have any firsthand experience of what the poet was talking about. And I thought, but isn't that the experience of every book we read, almost every book we read? I mean, don't we read to learn and gain that experience of someone else's experience?
Yes. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. The essay is, it's an essay by Daniel Brzezinski, who translates Chilean poetry from Spanish to English. And, it's so interesting that this essay is one of the more scholarly essays, and Daniel is commenting on a review that someone wrote about a translated collection, and I think that sometimes when you think about a translation, there's so much that can be lost, because sometimes you want to convey the meaning of a poem from its original language to English, and things will get lost. But in those instances, I think it can be tricky. You have to take into account whether some of the language is cultural, or some of the language can just be literally translated very literally. So that essay, I think, really spend some time thinking about how we go about understanding work that has been translated, and I think it pushes the reader to consider what might be missing, because I think sometimes we read work in translation. I think specifically of work by Pablo Neruda, who's been translated so often, and to think about whether or not there's actually something missing in these translations. I mean, it's possible. I haven't read everything by Neruda in Spanish, but this essay is an interesting essay to point out that, hey, reader, you might be reading a translation of a poem, but do you know if something's really missing? So I think it's really just kind of calling back and saying, we shouldn't take everything at face value, and we should consider who's doing the translation and why.
Yeah, translations are so tricky because you never quite know what lens they're reading through when they translate. But similar things can be said about just reading about any other culture than your own, is that things can be lost, not necessarily in straightforward translation, but in those cultural differences. You might read something one way and it's intended in completely a different way because of that culture.
Oh my goodness. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think about, I think about another essay in here that is focused on trauma. And, the essay is by a poet named Cheryl Luna. And in the essay, she spend some time thinking about the content, what it is that we write about, and how do we translate our experience as a writer when it's something that can be traumatic or content that is quite vulnerable, and how do we share that with the reader? How do we translate that experience on the page to not only be honest and accurate, but also without making the experience, without fetishizing the experience or creating an experience that is a spectacle, right? So thinking about what do we bring to the page and how do we bring it when it's an experience that can be as universal as trauma. And it's one of the Cheryl's essays, one of the first that I remember editing, and I was really struck by the universality of the topic, trauma in the lyric. And I think about so many poets and so many books that have been written about pain and about violence. And Cheryl's essay spends time thinking about ways in which and the value of writing about trauma and how we find that in poetry. And it's something that I think that I haven't seen very many Latin American poets share. I think it's kind of unusual. I think about there's a book by a scholar named Elaine Scarry. She wrote a book in the 80s called The Body in Pain. It's about pain and the body, obviously, but the idea of spending time meditating and thinking about the cultural significance of pain in this instance, or the cultural significance of certain types of trauma, as in Cheryl's essay, I think is something that is quite unusual. And even though it's coming from a Latin American perspective, it's still a topic that is accessible by anyone.
Absolutely, yes. Obviously, there are limitations on a collection like this. You can't include everything and every topic and every culture. But would you ever consider doing something similar with literary genres other than poetry?
Oh my goodness, I'm so glad you asked. Well, this anthology was published by the University of New Mexico Press, and they've been amazing. And the anthology has done exceptionally well. And I've been asked to submit a proposal for another anthology, and so I am going to start working on an anthology about prose poetry, and another kind of unusual topic for poetry lovers or readers of creative writing. Prose poetry is this really strange hybrid of poetry, but it's written in the prose form. And so, I think there's often been debate about whether prose poetry is poetic prose or if it's actually a poem in a prose form. And so I'm excited about tackling this next project. I'll be submitting my proposal this year, and maybe the anthology will be out next year or in 2025. But I'm excited that it's a topic, or it's a focus on a genre of poetry that can be opened up to so many different contributors, and so I'm excited about that.
That's really exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about your role as an editor? I I admit to not knowing a lot about how one goes about editing a collection, an anthology, anything. Can you talk about where do you even start?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been thinking about that a lot because over the years, I found myself taking on more and more editorial roles. And when I became interested in poetry, being an editor was not on my radar. And as a student of poetry, both as an undergrad and as a graduate student, I volunteered for the literary magazine at the universities that I spent time at, and so that gave me a taste of curating or collecting writing and figuring out how to organize that writing for a general reader or readers of poetry and other creative work. So, I was dipping my toe into that kind of work as a graduate student. And when I finished and started teaching, I found myself teaching these survey courses, a lot of introductory courses to writing and literature. And it's not always easy to give students a broad overview of work unless it's collected in an anthology. So anthologies are great for introductory courses to literature because you can show a breadth of the subject. And when I began teaching literature, this is when I started remembering the anthology that inspired my own, and thought, hey, I could probably do this. I've done it for literary magazines as a student. Maybe I can give this a shot. So that's when I started thinking about the project. And over the next few years, I began volunteering at different literary journals just as a reader. I remember when I first moved to Chicago, I was on social media and I wanted to know what was happening in the literary scene here. And so I did social media searches for different magazines and journals, and I found the editor and founder of the Chicago Review of Books. And this was probably about a decade or so ago. So the magazine was fairly new then. And I sent a direct message to the editor and said, I'm new in town. I am interested in supporting your journal in any way I can. I have some editorial experience. I'm a poet. I'd love to do anything that you'd like me to do. And they were interested in having more poetry related content on their website. So I started an interview series. And over the next several years, I ran an interview series where I interviewed different poetry editors and different poets, and just asked them lots of questions about their process and their writing process and their editorial process. And I learned a lot from doing that. It wasn't the practical side of it, of course, but I learned a lot about how other editors go about making certain decisions. And not too long after running this series, I started seeing opportunities to get more involved with journals as a poetry editor. And in 2019, I took on a role as poetry editor for a magazine out of Boston University called Agni. It's spelled Agni, Agni. And so I became a poetry editor there and did that for a couple of years. And that really was a great learning experience. It's a very old magazine. It receives tens of thousands of submissions a year. And so it was a steep learning curve, but a great learning experience, and really allowed me to hone this practice of reading work, trying to really get a sense of my own aesthetic, my own style and interest, and just through that kind of practice of working my way through different roles in magazines, and finally becoming an editor. of a magazine gave me the confidence and skills to write up a proposal, and now I take on different smaller opportunities to edit for journals. So right now, for instance, there's a journal called Poet Lore, LORE. It's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, literary journal in the country. And I'm editing a portion of their next issue. And this was something that really just came about from reaching out to the editors and reading the magazine. And I was so impressed by an issue they put out that was focused on how poets use punctuation. And that I approached the editor and I said, I love this idea. I would love to do something like this for your journal. I've been teaching courses on traditional poetic forms, and I would love to put together a small collection within your magazine on traditional poetic forms. I could gather work, I can select work, and they were excited about it. And they said, yeah, let's do it. So we put a call out into the world asking for submissions, and they received over 800 submissions in the period of about a month. And that is extraordinary. And so I'm in the middle of editing that, and that'll be out this fall. And so, it's a combination of things. Either an opportunity to do a little bit of work for a magazine presents itself, or you take that chance, you take that risk and just reach out and say, I'm really passionate and excited about learning how to do this work. Do you have anything I can do to help? And then eventually just kind of learning the trade, like an apprenticeship, and you just learn by doing. And I've been really fortunate to have had those opportunities and to I feel so privileged that I've been trusted with these different literary spaces to put these voices together.
Time for our final break of this episode. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Social Media Podcast. Time to hashtag everything. We talk about all the fun, crazy stories on social media. From Instagram to Facebook, Twitter to Tumblr, or probably even Friendster. Join us each week as we explore the quirky side of social media. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Social Media Podcast.
It's simple, such a sad song. The one that we rely on to get us.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with Ruben Quesada. Do you feel like being an editor has changed the way you personally write?
It does. It does in some ways. I think it's made me a better teacher. I think as a teacher of poetry and writing, as you can imagine, I have to give a lot of feedback to students, and so being an editor has taught me how to give feedback in a way that that considers the writer's intent without making the work my own. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I've learned how to be better at giving feedback, and I've learned how to identify opportunities for development or revision much faster. And I think it just comes with the practice. But in terms of my own work, I think that it's made me more attentive to my word choices, my diction. If anything, it has to, the biggest impact that editing has made on my writing has been that it's made me more considerate of the words that I want to put on the page. And this doesn't happen when I first write. I think it's important to just write it all out, just to get everything out, get it out of your head, get all those feelings out through the words on the page. And then having some time later to revise and change and remove. It's that process, that revision, that editing process that has become much easier for me. But I have been more attentive to just the words that I choose, because I want the words to have more music to them. I'm especially interested in the sound of vowels these days.
Oh, interesting. Fun. I usually ask guests if they have advice for aspiring authors, and you can include some of that as well. But do you have advice for someone who maybe has an idea for a collection or an anthology, or they're thinking, I could do that? Do you have advice for someone who might want to be an editor?
Yeah, I think if someone has an idea, I think they should write that idea down. Don't let it go, and spend some time thinking about a few things. Because if you want to find a publisher to put the book out, the majority of publishers are going to want you to answer certain questions about the idea. You're going to want to find out, is there anything that already exists that's like it? How is your idea going to either complement that or challenge what exists? Is it gonna fill a gap? And I think more importantly is, if you have a project in mind, it's important to find people that are willing to contribute to the project and who will agree to the project before you submit that proposal to someone, to a publisher, because having people on board is going to give the press confidence that this project is going to be completed. And also, it doesn't hurt to have some name recognition in your contributors. And sometimes you can ask a writer with name recognition for a contribution, but it's going to be much easier if you already know someone. And I know that's easier said than done. Or getting to know someone with name recognition may feel like it's out of someone's capacity. But if you're part of this community long enough, you get to meet a lot of people who are doing this work, and the community becomes smaller. You hear it all the time. It really is a small world. And if you're able to get people on board with your project, then your project has a greater likelihood of reaching a broader audience. I'm not saying that your project isn't going to happen, but I guess it just depends on what you want that project to do. And if you want it to reach as many readers as possible, and as many people, if you want it to have as much recognition as possible, then I think it's important to spend as much time as possible planning and thinking about a project before you actually execute it.
Yeah, makes sense. I'm laughing at myself because when you said, get to know people who might give you name recognition, my first introverted thought was, no, thank you. No. And I realized I'm part of a community where I know a lot of people who know a lot of people. So it's not as hard as I'm making it out to be.
Exactly. Yeah, I know. Once you start thinking about it, you probably do know a lot of people who know a lot of people. And so that's when those relationships really, I think, become or can come in handy.
Sure. For people who are interested in learning more about the book, or maybe you as the editor and a poet in your own right, can you talk to me about web pages and social media for both you and the book?
Sure. So I am on most social media platforms, including my personal website, rubenquesada.com. But you can find me on Twitter, where I'm most active, and then I'm also on Instagram and TikTok. TikTok is something I'm exploring, and LinkedIn. And so you can find links to all of that on my website, and you can find information about the anthology on my website as well, or on the University of New Mexico Press website. Or you can go to Google or Amazon and search for Latinx Poetics, and you'll be able to find the book there.
Perfect. Thank you. So we've talked about a few different things, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to make sure you highlighted in terms of the collection?
I just want to encourage people to go to their local libraries and ask for the book, or their local independent bookstores and ask for the book. And because the book is from a university press, it has a large distributor, and that means that it's cost effective for libraries and small bookstores to order the book. So ordering the book from your local resources, it means a lot to them, and it also means a lot to the press. And so I encourage everyone to go and find their books, find Latinx Poetics at their local bookstores and libraries, and if it's not available, ask them to order it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you also for taking the time to talk to me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much to Ruben for joining me to talk about this collection of essays. As I mentioned at the beginning, I wasn't quite sure what to expect, and it is at some points very scholarly and academic, and other points it reads a lot like memoir. People are writing of their experience either way, though it just depends on how they come about it. So I feel like I got a really broad and in-depth look at Latinx poetics, something that I might not have explored otherwise. Poetry in general is not something that I gravitate toward on a regular basis, unless it's the weird type of poetry that I write to make my sister and my nieces laugh, which is inspired a lot by Dr. Seuss and or Shel Silverstein. And that's the type of poetry I read. So not really academic poetry, but I am glad that I got to have this experience, that I got to read a little bit outside my comfort zone. I love learning, and this was a great opportunity to learn about people's impetuses behind the poetry that they write, and how culture and language and so many different things shape that writing. So, and for someone who loves learning, this was great. And again, there's so many entry points into this collection, because really you can go through and see which topics appeal to you, which writing styles appeal to you, and learn more about writing poetry, the whole process of writing poetry, but also maybe find some new poets that you haven't heard of or you haven't read, or maybe you have heard of them, you have read them, and you want to know a little bit more about how their brains work, how their poetry is written. This is a great way to do that. So if this is a topic that you're interested in, or if you know somebody who is interested in this, you should definitely recommend the book to them or get it for yourself. And as Ruben said at the end, go to your library, go to your bookstore, and see if they have it and if they can order it, because this is definitely something that would be great to have at any local library, so lots of people can have access to it. So thank you again to Ruben. Thank you as always to you for joining me. Hope you'll join me next week for my next interview. I will be speaking with author Tracy Clark. We are turning back to thrillers. This is the first book in a new series. It's called Hidden, and it is about a Chicago police detective who is coming back on the job after some very difficult experiences, and she's got one heck of a case. So join me for that conversation. I'm excited to meet Tracy and talk to her. Hope you are, as always, having a great week. And if you're a fan of this podcast, You know what's coming. You can do me a few quick things that will help get this podcast out to more people, just like you can do quick things to help the authors that you love by leaving reviews of their books. You can leave a review of this podcast. Written, starred, one sentence, a paragraph, it really doesn't matter. Anything helps that algorithm. So take a moment if you haven't done so and leave a review. Greatly appreciate that. Also, you can follow on the podcast platform that you're listening to the podcast on to make sure you always know when there are new episodes available. And finally, social media, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Love hearing from you. Come find the podcast on social media and tell me what you've been up to, what you've been reading. Thank you again. Hope you're having a great week so far. Hope you're staying cool wherever you are if it's hot. And as always, I hope whatever you're doing, wherever you are, however hot it is where you are finding yourself plenty of time to get lost in as many good books as you can stand up to. Thanks so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.